Shabbat Shalom, everybody. This is Rav Shmuel. Rosh be with you. Rav Shmuel ben Yehoshua, Rabbi Stephen Epstein with this week's Torah portion. So I know my voice sounds a little raspy. I'm getting over the illness. I finally succumbed, like many of you. Um, got to take care of ourselves, folks. We got to do what we got to do to stay healthy. And, you know, it is what it is. It is what it is. So. But we're one big happy family. We just keep giving it to each other because we love each other, right? We're all humans here on this planet. Anyway, so before we get into discussing this week's Parsha, which is Tzav, command, um, our synagogue suffered a really big loss this past week. We lost Harriet Pomerantz. She was an icon with the synagogue. Her and her husband, Philip, were not just big contributors and very, very involved in Temple Shalom of Ontario, but they were also very big in the community. They started a medical school. I believe it was a osteopathy. There are medical doctors, MDs, and there are DOs, doctors of osteopathy. And I think it was Western Medical Center that they both started. They gave generously to causes. Just wonderful people, and their sons, Richard and Andrew, are continuing their work in many ways. Richard, of course, with his wife, Brigida, are very involved in our synagogue. And, in her last days, we were lucky enough, I will say it that way. We were lucky enough and fortunate enough to have Harriet join us as much as she could. Her last years were kind of waning, but she still came to services. She got called up for Leo's with her family, and of course we made sure that she was honored as she should be, and she will continue to be honored. This week we'll have a special service for her in her honor, and there it is. It's interesting, but the when you talk about the confessional, right? That's what we Jews call it when somebody is you don't know, but it seems pretty likely that they're on their way out. We do a series of prayers, and part of that prayer is saying, if this is my time, then let my death be an atonement for some of the sins or whatever sins I may have committed, whatever I did in my lifetime. And of course, we say, if not, God grant me the health, to continue living. But, if I got to go, then at least let this be an atonement. Now, the Talmud takes that a little bit further and says, whenever you have an illness, like we all have now, it's basically you're making up for sins. It's kind of like, I don't like this. I don't like to use the word punishment. Let's use the word consequence. It's a consequence of some negative actions, and it's a way for you to atone for it. The same way that on Yom Kippur, or when else we are looking for atonement, we fast. We deny ourselves food and water as a way, not so much for self-punishment. We Jews don't really believe that. But what we do is we make it uncomfortable. We're sacrificing comfort in order to show God we're really sincere about, atonement, about making up for what we've done wrong. So just a little bit of stuff there. Now let's segue a little bit. Harriet was part of I think what we call the great generation, as was my father, as was many people my age who have parents that are still living. The great generation were the folks that fought World War II and participated in this wonderful growth of suburbia after World War II, this wonderful time of prosperity that our country has enjoyed, new technology, new industries that came out of that. And a lot of them were very dedicated to synagogues. We've seen, in fact, they were almost single-handedly responsible for the growth of conservative Judaism. That middle ground, that Goldilocks movement, not too strict, not too loose, retaining tradition, but not so rigid that you can't adapt and maybe have women come up to the bima, that type of thing. And they were very dedicated. We had a guest cantor, the Grabners, their brother-in-law came, and he honored us by doing a Shachrit service that was very old school, where you start with the first part of the prayer, and then, everybody else davens. You pick it up at the end, kind of old school. Now, and it was very nice. Now, why do I go on about this? All right. How is this segueing from our Parsha? Well, we finished up Exodus with the commandments, and then the actual carrying out of the construction of the Mishkan, of the actual mobile temple, right, that we're bringing around the wilderness, and its furnishing, the menorah, the table, the incense altar, the offering altar, these things. And now we start Leviticus, which is, some have called that, a book of the manuals for the Levites as to how to officiate and how to carry out the various processes of the various offerings, the offerings that we have, the sin offering, the guilt offering, the meal offering, the Thanksgiving offering, etc. So we have a very dedicated ancestral group that was so excited to get it, to build it. It took them about a year. Now it's finished, and now they get to officiate, and now they get to actually participate and start this thing that we now call Judaism. Just like this other generation, what an inspiration. These people were very dedicated. You've heard me lament many times about how we have kids that come in for Hebrew school or religious school Sundays. It's an hour and a half, talking about when I was a kid, one of those things, that I was there Tuesday for 2 hours with my peers, Thursday for 2 hours, Sunday for 3 hours. Okay. We're going to be coming up to Passover, and I'm doing all four services. I'm doing Passover 1, Passover 2, Passover 7, and Passover 8, and Passover 7 this year is going to coincide with Shabbat, but we're going to do all those services. That's what I'm used to. That's what I grew up with. That's what we Jews are supposed to do. That's what the Torah tells us to do. During that time, you make those 3 pilgrimage festivals. Pilgrimage, you get up wherever you are in Israel, and you take whatever supplies you need, and you trek down to Jerusalem. That's what you did for Passover, Shavuot, and for Sukkot. That's what you do. And these people that we read about in the Torah were excited. Wow, if I made a mistake, it's not the end of the world. There are ways I can deal with it. If my cattle or my goats or my herd, accidentally intruded onto somebody's yard, well, I have to make a penalty. Sure, I have to make it up to them. I have to make them whole, some type of remedy. But also, it's an affront against God because, let's face it, God, we rent the land from God. It's really God's land. So there's an offering that goes with this, and we can do that, and we can sacrifice, and we can make up for it, and we feel, okay, now we can move on with our life. It's great. Same thing with a sin offering, where you've transgressed the negative commandments. And when I was explaining this to the kids on Sunday, I said, it's like when your parents tell you don't eat the cookies before dinner, it'll spoil your appetite. That's a negative commandment. You go and you eat the cookies. Now you got to get punished. Now you got to go sit in your room. That's your atonement, right? Maybe they make you work off the cookies that you ate. I don't know. But that's basically what it is. Judaism recognizes that we are flawed. After the Tower of Babel, God comes down to earth, metaphorically speaking, of course, and says, humans are evil. I created them in my image, but I myself, God, have the capacity to recognize between good and evil. So does humankind. And sometimes they let themselves get ahead of themselves and they succumb to evil. Now, some people, as we know, do that on purpose, and there's a whole slew of discussion about what happens to them. But for the rest of us, we're generally good. We're flawed. We succumb every now and then. Isn't it nice to know that, one mistake, you don't pay for it forever, unless, of course, it's murder, and that's another issue. But there are ways for us flawed humans to make up for things. And in making up, we learn and we grow. And that's what this is all about. That's what Torah is all about. Getting close to God, fulfilling God's desire to have us live in a utopia, in an enlightened time. And that time, the Messianic age is coming. The sooner we start practicing God's laws and God's teachings, the sooner we'll get there. And this is one way, by these offerings, to make up, to thank God for certain things, to just get the thanks offering, the burnt offering, where we just sacrifice something because we just feel we want to get closer to God. The guilt offering, we did something wrong. The sin offering, we transgressed the negative commandment. So Judaism is a very positive, very optimistic idea, and that's what we need to continue to do. So, of course, I ask you to get involved and make the most of it with us, okay? And for those of you that are not Jewish, thank you for listening anyway. Apply it to your own philosophies and your own systems of religion. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for listening, and I certainly appreciate, all the likes on YouTube.